For being with us here on the webinar. I'm Mike Annett. I'm taking the lead in presenting our webinar, which is Do Technologies Enhance Workplace Communications? How to Use Technologies to Create an Inclusive Culture. And running the session with me are Ada Tai and Renata Burwash. As an introduction to our webinar, we're starting with a short video that helps to introduce myself, Ada, and Renata.
I'm Renata. I'm a diversity and inclusion consultant and a director of diversity and inclusion for an Edmonton nonprofit organization. In my years of experience working with large and small businesses across industries, one thing I know is that those who make inclusion a priority not only see changes like higher engagement and productivity, companies with strong inclusive cultures also fare better in times of change and turmoil.
Hi, I am Mike. I am a professor and most active in teaching and writing related to diversity and inclusion, health and safety, and returning to work after injury and illness. I advocate for social responsible management practices and believe there is solid D&I work to be done in society at large, the boardroom table, and on the shop floor.
Hello, I'm Ada. I'm a human resources consultant, university instructor, and a job search trainer. As a professional with a unique background in a very diversified workforce, I have seen organizations achieving their great competitive advantages by implementing inclusion strategies and practices.
Providing one-on-one and small group coaching to help managers deal with specific issues. Suggesting best practices. Recognizing and celebrating your organization's achievements.
Reviewing your workplace diversity and inclusion practices and physical accessibilities. Measuring and analyzing employee engagement through surveys and focus groups, conducting customized research to help build business cases for decision making, and providing access to our regularly updated research, articles, tips, and trends.
We can help your organizations to review your policies, procedures, and job descriptions to make sure they're inclusive and provide you with a checklist with recommended action items. We also host a group training to improve your workplace awareness, as well as help you build a short and long-term strategic plan around D&I.
Wonderful. So, as mentioned, Ada, Renata, and I are happy to talk with you about diversity and inclusion in the midst of this COVID-19 situation. Ada, just join again and say hello.
Yes, hello everybody. Since mid-March, companies and workers have undergone significant changes, with many people shifting to work from home, including myself. Some people have experienced more challenges in this change than other people, but there is no doubt that we're learning lots about remote working and doing it right.
Quite right, Ada. And Renata, please also say hello.
Hi, everyone. There's no perfect answers in this situation, but there are certainly good ideas for attention, including ensuring that people working remotely and the supervisors enabling them have as much opportunity as possible to remain included and feel connected to their work and to their colleagues.
Right, thank you. And you've both touched on the main reasons we put this webinar together, to discuss how thoughtful employers mitigate unintentional exclusion that arises during remote working, because it can happen, and understand where there's opportunity for action to address workplace communication challenges through different technologies. And for a quick note of those joining us on the webinar, your microphones are muted and we don't have video presenting. We will use the chat function, which should be at the bottom area of your screen, to ask a few questions, and we also have a poll or two to get your input on a couple matters. So a little bit of engagement that way. Now, moving forward. As we think about people in their working today, we can think about them being in three different groupings or types of workers. One of those is those that are on site and currently working. The second one would be those that are remote, likely being at home and working in some capacity. And Ada had mentioned that that was her situation. And those that are remote but not working or essentially idle. So for example, our grocery store clerks are certainly on-site and working now. Our teachers, as we've heard lots of stories, are remote and working. And many of our recreation facility staffs are remote and idle. They can't have lifeguards in the facilities when there is no water in the pools, and so there's nothing for the lifeguards to be doing except being at home. They're still on staff. Now, for each of these groups, it's important that they feel connected to the organization and respected by their supervisors. This is true whether they're on-site or remote, and whether they're working or idle. And let's think about the remote and idle group for a moment. It may seem a little bit less obvious, but consider the importance of inclusion for them. When it's time to reopen our facilities, we want a work group that isn't harboring resentment or having some feelings of disconnection or discontent. It's a good idea to ensure that this group feels included, even if they're not actively working. Now, to focus this webinar, we are going to focus on folks that are remote and working. Employers must be thoughtful to ensure that these workers do not have actual experiences being left out, whether by intentional or unintentional means. Now, when we talk about inclusion, and I'm sure when you hear the word inclusion, some thoughts might come to mind about what it means for you, how you might describe it. Now, we have a definition that we're working with, and you may have heard some of these keywords already, but this definition is from independentsector.org, and it's derived from a number of fantastic other sources. So when we're talking about inclusion in this webinar, we're meaning that people feel welcomed, respected, supported, and valued to fully participate. This means that our remote workers don't feel separate and siloed, and nor are they being used as a resource. As our title on the slide show, out of sight and out of mind, but also some of our remote workers being out of sight, they're going a bit out of their mind, wanting to become included, wanting to be more actively involved, and not sure how they could participate best. And in that situation, maybe feeling more as a resource that's getting some things done, but not as the full person they are. So these are all possible feelings when people feel marginalized and don't perceive a real connection to their workplace. Now, if you've been working for a bit, I'm sure you can think of an example where you felt included. And hopefully you have a harder time thinking of an example of the opposite. We want to check in with you and open up the chat function to ask this question. If you would write in the chat box an example of when and why you felt included during your work time. So to do that, you should be able to open the chat function on the bottom of your screen and answer the question there again. To write in the chat box an example of when and why you felt included during this remote working time. I've written an organization sends regular emails on budget and other updates. So I may not be involved in the active participation of the university, but I am aware of some of the main decisions that are being reviewed and thought about. Oh, Chantel, that's an excellent contribution about being reached out and connected because they understand that you understand the business processes really well. Anita, thank you for your contribution as well. So we're going to keep the chat open. We know that it might take a moment to think, or as an example, or may not be interested at this time, but something may come and spark your mind a little bit later on. So leave the chat window available for you. But moving forward a little bit, that some people may be thinking that now is not the time to be focusing on inclusion, right? We're in crisis mode here. We just need people to get stuff done. And we don't have time to make sure people feel respected and supported. Now, let's let that hang in the air for a second. That may not be the words that are expressly being said, but it's essentially saying, we don't have time to make people feel respected and supported. That it's a sentiment that's rarely expressed, but frequently demonstrated in our normal times and now, when we are pushing through projects, when we are just trying to make decisions as best we can with incomplete information, which is normal, but we haven't taken time to check in with people that might be affected in that area. And Renata, you've had a few thoughts about this being the perfect time to emphasize an inclusive approach.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have reviewed some consulting and academic studies on inclusion to determine when inclusion pays off the most. And what we found is that groups with more and different voices that are highly engaged and are willing to fully participate do perform better in situations where creativity and adaptation and adjustments are needed. So that sounds a lot like the current COVID-19 situation right now that we're dealing with, when companies are making adjustments to business operations and are figuring out how to stay afloat. Throw in the challenges of managing a workforce remotely, and you can see inclusive approach is really the only way to operate.
Right, absolutely. And a bit further into the webinar, we'll talk about some various technologies that can be used to enhance inclusion in respect to the various differences of workers. But first, I want to clarify the opposite case. What is exclusion? And we'll discuss it in two forms. First one is the intentional exclusion, when there's separation or silence or subservience is actually meant to occur. And the second one is unintentional exclusion, where action or inaction that without intent results in separation or silence or subservience. Now, a relatable situation is direct discrimination and indirect discrimination. There's still biased and unfair action that disadvantages a person, and both should be avoided. But there's definitely a difference in maliciousness. And group that's on the webinar with us, please take a moment to think for yourself. What are some examples of intentional and unintentional exclusion that you may have seen or experienced during COVID-19? We're going to ask you to chat about those again in a moment, but again, just take a second to think, what are you seeing about intentional or unintentional exclusion? Now, we do want to ask you, through a second type of engagement, through a poll, is about the inclusivity of your organization. Earlier chat, you'd mentioned a few times where you may have felt that you are being included. And it's a poll that I'm now bringing up on the screen. Just ask you to assess from 1 being low to 5 being high. How do you rate your organization's inclusivity during COVID-19 time? If you would, please share your thoughts. Okay, so we have a couple people on the call here with us. At least we're in the higher end of things, one answer being at the highest and 2 being at 4. So overall, sounds like things are going reasonably well in organizations. All right, I'll end that poll. Thank you for participating that way. Now, we didn't ask you to name any of your exclusion examples yet. So first we're going to share a few and then ask you to add on again via the chat function. So a couple moments to think in advance. Now, it's easy to find a bad straw dog examples for exclusion, where the perpetrator is clearly a bad person. We've opted instead to provide a few illustrations where it's not so obvious. And that's a little bit more true to form for our experiences. And Ada is going to share a few of these examples.
Yeah, working in human resources, we have seen a lot of layoffs these days. The layoff notices, many businesses have no option but to close their doors now and hope to reopen later. When that happens, they want their employees to come back. But for now, they have to clearly say that, unfortunately, you're not part of our active workforce. You are separate from us. Second, concentration of information and decision-making. In the early days of COVID-19 and still now, many companies form some version of a business survival team that make critical decisions on operations, money, employees, and etc. This has a natural excluding effect as some people are in the know and others wait to hear what's decided on matters that will affect their work and potentially their livelihood. And third, awaiting parallel conversations and project actions. During the normal times, meetings, people often hear and act upon things differently and only later realize they went down a different path than the others. This is difficult in remote working, where it's easy for people to go down one track without checking in with their colleagues. Last but not least, the high use of remote communications. We're going to focus more on this area in a moment, but there can be huge issues in message intent, tone, and transmission that lead to feelings of exclusion and disrespect. The most simple example is when people being accidentally left out on the email chain because an old email distribution list was used. And I have experienced something similar like this just recently.
Yeah, thanks, Ada. And sadly, that happens quite a bit in our normal operations. When we catch it, when we see people in the hallway and they say, hey, did you get this notice? Are you attending this meeting? We go, oh, no, I didn't get invited. Like, oh, we can fix it. But in the remote situation where we're not casually jumping into social spaces with people, we just don't realize that people are being left out. So we have a few probable situations here where exclusion can arise. But to what extent is exclusion for remote workers actually a problem? So here's some points to reinforce that exclusion is a real problem for remote workers. I'll have you read for yourself the first 2 bullet points. Let's take a moment for that. Now consider that the stats about professionalization and the intranets are actually pre-COVID. They're from 2019, probably answers given in early 2019 or late 2018. And so certainly it's more of a problem now. And also note that when they talk about professional isolation, they're referring to information, opportunity, development, and social. So there's certainly a lot of ways that remote workers experience being left out and not be able to get to the connections and resources that they would normally have or feel like people that are in the workplace are getting. Now take a look at the last 2 points. I'm sure that these ring a bell for many people. Taking a second to reflect on the media and anecdotes that you might have heard about, maybe the funny and not so funny video conference fail stories, examples of worker burnout, mental health. And consider again that our definition of inclusion focuses on workers feeling welcomed, respected, supported, and valued. And so exclusion really is a problem for remote workers. We're going to ask you a question now. Well, what kind of problems you might have heard about regarding exclusion? So I bring the chat window back on. And if you would, take a moment, we'll have a few minutes here, to write a comment about problems that you have heard about where remote workers are being excluded. Hey, Greg, I'm happy to see that you report you haven't heard of any of your travels. That's a wonderful group you work in. Sadly, I've been part of some other conversations where a video conference is happening, and then some other people are involved inside text conversations, poking fun or talking about how they might not share information with other people. Sounds malicious, and it is. And what's terrible about it is other people on the call have no idea that those conversations are going on because they're separate. And so even some intentional exclusion happening. Okay, and Chantal, thanks for sharing about the quick flows, definitely leading to some time delays. And Constant sharing about parents that with kids are not being explained what their role is, right? So certainly some things there. Okay, so we're going to leave the chat window open again. Thank you for your conversation. This is helpful for us as we're thinking about diversity and inclusion and issues that we may need to help address through our services and offerings. Now to move forward a little bit, we're going to talk about diversity and remote communications. So the question would be, how do we act in ways that foster inclusion and mitigate exclusion? And we're going to use diversity as a starting point. That is to recognize the ways in which people differ and do our best to accommodate those. And really this is clearing away the underbrush to ensure that employees can actively participate in the remote communications and thus actively participate in their work. And the suggestions we offer are also a pathway for showing respect and value, which is as much a part of inclusion as active participation. So some sample attributes. Now, setting aside the usual points of diversity that we talk about, like age and gender and race, we're going to present a few other attributes that deserve consideration and accommodation for our remote communications. So for example, communication, things like hearing, reading, and language. Cognition, the mental health and well-being of people involved, their attention span, ability to focus. And technological competency, their knowledge and ability to use various technologies. And situation, technology availability and internet bandwidth. Can you even get the messages where you're at? Home environment, and social generational norms. Now, Ada, is there an attribute here that you wanted to elaborate upon a bit?
Yeah, definitely. Being in the younger generation human resources consultant, I've often hear stereotypes about the millennials generations that don't like to write full sentences. We tend to use acronyms or slangs that only our generation would understand better. To some extent, that's true. We can communicate, but that has put on some barriers for other people who do not speak this generation's language. Recently, I've also heard an example about some younger people don't even read handwritten notes. So that's a new one for me.
Right. And if much of the communication is through written means, if you're not speaking the same language, so to speak, there'd be certainly challenges there to be addressed. And Renata, is there an attribute you wanted to share a bit more about?
Yeah, I mean, communication is obviously vital to the success of the team and the organization. And I think our focus really needs to be on listening first and foremost. So, listening to team members in regards to their most efficient ways of communicating, tech problems they may be having, especially those I'm noticing people that are in the rural areas are having a lot of tech problems, and that causes a lot of frustration on their end and a lot of communication problems. And then also just discussing their styles of communicating, kind of as Ada was talking about, but also different platforms that work best for them. And also keeping in mind their attention span in this kind of current environment of over communication. All of these will kind of build, this effective communication is going to build trust within the team. And it's also going to minimize stress, something we could all use right now, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. And as we're talking about diversity, it's easy to jump to issues of discrimination, which may be protected in our human rights codes. And certainly we want to guard against that. We're also being a bit more expansive. We're talking about differences and distinctions and taking time to note what those may be, and then accommodating or addressing those so that everybody can fully and actively participate in the conversations that are happening. And it's easy for some people, maybe most of us, to think that other people on the video conference call, in the email, in the messages that we're doing are in our same situation, and they don't have noisy home environments, or they don't have children in the background, or they don't have the same level of technology competency or what have you. And so paying attention to the differences helps us to show respect and appreciation, which leads to the feelings of inclusion. Now, we did prepare a few additional examples for you, again, focusing on our remote workers, of why they may not receive, process, or share information effectively for some of these reasons. They have a language unfamiliarity or hearing impairment that reduces their oral comprehension, which may be compounded by lagging or disrupted video conference feeds. But to see that in plain language, if somebody is speaking the language they're not familiar with, or they themselves are maybe perhaps English as a second language, they have a hearing impairment, or there's a noisy background, they simply can't hear the conversation. If they can't hear the conversation, understand it well, they can't really participate in it very well. If you happen to have a lagging internet and you're getting the sound glitches and the freeze frames, definitely then the flow of information is going to be very much disrupted for that person. As a second example, they may have a speech impediment themselves, or an accented voice that's difficult for their audience to understand. And so they may have had time to use body language, visual cues, and other media on site. But when it's all over the phone or through video conference, it may be more difficult for the transmission of information from the sender's side of things. They may better process information in written form and feel overwhelmed by the audio-visual overload and pace of communications. There's just too many people talking at a time. The information is flowing by too quickly for them to understand it. They'd much prefer to have the written memo or the email, the document to refer to, than simply oral communication. And they have a disruptive home-based work environment that makes it difficult to concentrate and communicate. So these are all some, again, points of diversity or difference where respecting and understanding and working with them enables people to more fully participate in the workforce, in their work, and feel involved in the company. Now, we've just walked through a couple examples, and I'll bring the previous slide back up. I will try to, excuse me. So with these sample attributes and points of diversity, our poll question is going to be, which of these attributes does your organization most need to act upon? If you could increase inclusion at your organization, where would you want to pay most attention? So I'll bring the poll over. Is it in the category of communication, in the category of cognition, in the category of situation? Where would your organization need to most act upon to ensure inclusion? Okay, so we're seeing answers in cognition and situation. Let's give another couple seconds for answers to come in. Okay, thank you for sharing your thoughts. Going through the slides here again. Okay, so if we know that technology is a bit of an issue, and we had that in the situational category, what kind of technologies can help address these points of diversity and facilitate inclusion? And since we want to ensure that our written messages are understood and interpreted correctly, our first suggestion is Grammarly, and that's for assuring the message has the desired tone. Now, you may be familiar with Grammarly and their advertisements talking about grammar correction and spelling correction, so cleaning up the writing. But Grammarly also has services about tone and making sure the message is coming across in the way you intend it. Now, we've all mostly learned that all caps is essentially yelling. There's much more to be concerned about. So Grammarly will check for about 20 different tones and advise you if it sounds friendly or formal, disapproving, or even regretful. Because it's often not what you write, but how you write it, and even more how it's read, that makes the difference in the communications. And so Grammarly may be a tool you wish to use for your emails or memos to make sure that the receiver who's receiving a bit of a vacuum isn't reading into it meaning or emotion that you don't intend. Now, audio conversation is good. Sometimes the more rich communication through a video conference is important. And further, the video helps with body language interpretation, but more importantly for inclusion, it helps guard against the multitasked and non-attentive communication that can happen when you're on regular phone calls. You may have experienced this yourself when you're on a phone call. It becomes tempting to look at paperwork or other things might be on your screen and find yourself in a moment of distraction. That can happen when you're having regular video calls or even group conference calls. And so having video does help ensure that people are visibly present and kind of held to account for being present. Now, if you want to use video calls, and you may be familiar with these already with the COVID-19 situation, lots of communications, but examples are Skype, Google Meet, and Zoom. But the point that we want to share is that in order to help some of those points of diversity, is that some of these services offer live subtitles and live caption. Now, for example, if you have lagging video, this might be a situational point of diversity that needs to be addressed or simply respected. And another challenge for video and audio calls that speakers may have enunciation challenges on their end, and audiences may have difficulty hearing for a variety of reasons. So in both those cases, the live captions, such as being used on this webinar and offered by Skype and Google Meets, may be of assistance. And further, PowerPoint offers these too, plus simultaneous language translation that may be helpful. So for example, a native English speaker can be translated to another language, or a native Mandarin speaker can be translated into English for the audience. The one-way translations can be achieved through subtitles that are built into PowerPoint, and that's what we're using here. And if we wanted to have audience members share in their native language and brought to English, for example, then a separate PowerPoint add-in is required, but it is possible. And so again, consideration for organizations that may have a number of newcomers to Canada with different language preferences. These kind of things would certainly help them become more involved and connected by having the language presented on screen. Now, a final point on video conferences is that these can often be recorded through built-in services. But additional tools like Camtasia can be used for editing and making clips of those calls. You can also use Camtasia and the video conference services to make short video messages rather than writing emails and memos. Again, for those folks that prefer to hear and see things than to read them. And sometimes these video messages are faster to make and view than crafting and reading memos. Now you can also consider using services like, like Scribby for automated transcription of video and audio calls, as this enables later review and reference and helps those folks that have a hard time processing the audible instructions and really need to see the written words. And lastly, the data shared earlier indicated that intranets are a problem for remote workers. So one way for groups of people to work more effectively together is to use apps like OneNote or Evernote as shared notebooks for communal access and contribution. These work really well for projects and can reduce the reliance on shared drives. So certainly there are many options to consider and lots that can be done. Here's a guiding principle though to follow. I suggest that you default to the lowest common denominator for the remote communications. So really what is the most accessible for all people. And then ask about and make efforts for accommodations when the higher order solutions are needed. So in the last few minutes, we took a deeper dive down some points of diversity that might easily lead to exclusion, and when accommodated through general consideration or technological solutions, can easily contribute to feelings of inclusion and actual full participation of employees in their work. Now, to wind down the webinar, we wanted to share a few other opportunities for inclusion of remote workers. You'll notice our triangle of inclusion image on the slide. We believe that strong and meaningful inclusion requires intention and action in the areas of culture, voice, and process. And Renata is going to share a few ideas about culture.
Hi, yes. Oh, so culture is really about sustaining a group's identity. So for remote workers, it's really important to remain part of the team and put extra attention and energy into that during these times. And for that, you could have ad hoc challenges like household treasure hunts. I know that I've been involved in a few of those now. Team picture collages and non-business virtual water cooler chats. So also don't forget, compliments go a long way right now.
Thanks, Renata. And Ada, you had a few thoughts about voice.
Yes, so voice is really important, which means that we want to hear back from our employees. When people feel they're respected, they're heard at work, they're more willing to contribute to the workforce. So during the COVID-19 time, when a lot of people are working remotely, in order for us to hear their voice and hear their inputs, we can simply do polls, virtual suggestion box using Google Forms or SurveyMonkey, those anonymous survey tools. You could also initiate skunkworks projects that get employees creatively addressing some of the nagging corporate issues. But lastly, be sure to have regular performance excellence conversations. Yes, you heard that right. Instead of saying performance reviews, to make it sound positive, we call it performance excellence conversations. Those conversations should focus on what's working and what they believe is needed for their success in this difficult situation.
Thank you. And I've already shared quite a bit about process and remote communications, but would add on to pay attention to the content of what's being shared and ensuring that employees have lots of information to work with. Right? It's really hard for them to be adaptive and creative, which is the point of inclusion, when they're in an informational vacuum. Okay, so that's the main ideas and perspectives that we wanted to share through the webinar. As you transition away from the webinar to your next activity, please keep the following in mind. Diversity and inclusion efforts help companies respond better to situations where stable and same is not an option. Acknowledging and accommodating points of diversity in remote communications helps remove barriers to participation. And ceasing intentional exclusion and guarding against unintentional exclusion, helps workers to feel respected, valued, and supported, which increases their motivation and contributions. And this is certainly critical during COVID-19 and after. So why don't we transition now to questions? We'll use the Q&A chat box again. And if you have questions for myself, Ada, Renata, please take a moment to ask them. We'll do our best to answer. And once we've got a sense that the questions have wrapped, we have just a couple more slides to share about things that are coming up through our organization.
I'll answer one of these questions that's come up. It says, we seem to be over communicating and spending all our time in Zoom meetings, Microsoft meetings, etc. And it's getting harder and harder to find the time to get the work done. Do you have suggestions? And I think this is an issue for all of us. So I would say, first, does everyone need to be in that meeting? You know, and also it's a good idea to have some rules in all these meetings at the beginning. If something needs to be discussed between two people, they can take it outside that meeting, because I think we've all sat in meetings where two people are trying to problem solve an issue that doesn't affect you. And then also, you know, maybe a meeting at the beginning of the week to kind of discuss action plans and action items, and then, you know, maybe put together an Excel spreadsheet or something. So some of these things can just be viewed instead of having a meeting every time. Those are some of my suggestions. I don't know if Ada or Mike have anything to add to that question, that answer?
Maybe I'll just add in that people do talk about overuse of Zoom or related video conference sessions, feeling quite burned out by it. And there's some general guidance to recognize that it is quite stressful for people to be on video calls all the time. So one of our points was start at the lowest needed possible, which maybe be an audio. And then if you need to escalate it up to video to help the richness of communication, you can do that. Or if there's a sense that maybe some strange things are happening, people aren't fully participating or being kind of exclusionary on the call, you can up it as well. But if you're upping it, then recognize it can be fatiguing for people that are trying to be on all the time. And as you're watching that, then recognizing the stress that people may be undertaking as they're presenting themselves on the screen and watching for body cues and body language and really focusing this way. And so in that, ask if your employees are feeling strained through the video conference calls, right? It might be a very rich way to communicate and very good for a number of reasons, but asking them about their strain, their frustration, helps them feel like they're being at least respected as we're trying to work through the situation. And if needed, drop down the number of calls or find alternate ways of communicating so that the idea of Zoom fatigue isn't as real for people in your organization.
That's a really good point. And I see a question come in is that if our business is temporarily shutting down, do we still need to keep regular dialogues or contacts with our employees during the shutdown period? From my perspective, the suggestion is yes, definitely, because the COVID-19 situation is temporary. As our province, beginning of this month, is slowly testing reopening of businesses, we're going to see business starting back to resume some sort of operations. That may change in the near future, but with that being said, as we resume some operations, we need workers to join us. So we definitely do not want to lose that momentum. Secondly, we also don't want to lose the confidence from our workers. So maintain regular and respectful communication during this tough time. Not only make your workers feel supported and respected, but also give them the confidence that they will have their jobs back. And also, our employees are just like our customers. So the reputation of our business can be built up. It took a very long time to build up a reputation, but it can take a very simple thing to destroy a good reputation that was being built. So we want to make sure that our employees and customers are well communicated, but also take into consideration what we have shared in our presentation today. Use multiple ways to communicate with different people as they have different needs in communication styles.
All right, very good. So I'm going to wrap us up here. We have 2 more webinars coming up in the series. You can register using the URL noted below. First webinar is, Does Remote Working Hurt Your Organizational Culture? And that is on May 21st. And in that one, we'll share real data collected with local businesses on how they effectively communicate with workers while working remotely. and how to use technology to collect employee inclusion and engagement data. And then we have a session on May 28th, the gradual return to work. Are your inclusion lessons learned or languished? And there we will explore the considerations that businesses need to consider when reopening its doors to employees and customers to ensure a safe and inclusive transition. So thanks for joining us. More information on our diversity and inclusion services is on our website. To request a copy of the slides, you can email us at the address listed. You can contact us on the phone, and we're all available for individual discussion and connection at our respective LinkedIn pages. Again, thanks for joining us. We're ending the webinar now. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.
Yeah, thank you. We'll send out the recording to your registered email address.